This is Shuja Rabbani, and you are listening to the Pod Your Heart Out podcast. I believe that the right to work in a safe and healthy work environment is everyone's human right. A workplace where there is humanity in human resources and a place where leadership leads by example. Join me in today's conversation if you see yourself as an advocate for that kind of workplace. People spend more time at work than they do at home. At least that was the case in the pre-pandemic era. If only we could get more HR professionals speaking about this topic more openly, without any fear, I think it would help a lot in terms of making workplaces more safe, psychologically safe. This is exactly how workplaces should be, and help remove miserable workplaces from people's lives. Because ultimately, if a workplace is toxic, that negativity doesn't end at work. People bring it home. It impacts people's lives and not just people's careers. So today I'm going to talk about the Ellen DeGeneres show and what the allegations were about this show last year in 2020. In summer last year, during the pandemic lockdown, there was an article on BuzzFeed which was speaking about cases of racism, sexual harassment, and bullying in Ellen DeGeneres show, which subsequently led to the Warner Brothers studio, which hosts the show, to conduct an investigation, eventually leading to termination of 3 of the top executives. And when I was reading the initial article, which was, quite detailed, and it went into the nitty-gritty details, where the journalist spoke to one of her current employees and 10 former employees. So there was more than enough accounts to really hold true in terms of the allegation of a toxic workplace. And when I finished reading this article, it really reminded me a lot about my former workplace. And it was just incredible because in the other podcasts, I have talked about, for example, how some of the practices that other big companies such as Amazon conduct. Google has had sexual harassment cases with top executives, which had led to the Google walkout movement around the world. And similarly to that, even with the Ellen DeGeneres show, even though she came out in September when she started her 18th season, she was very upfront and open about it, that no changes are being made. She's aware that her name is on the show. This is her name and her reputation on the line. The thing is that with a lot of the big brands, big names, and big companies, a lot of these cases go completely anonymous and ignored. And it really had to take an investigative journalist to speak to people who, most of them were anonymous, but they at least came on the record in some cases and laid it all out there. And this is not supposed to be the case. In order to create a safe work environment where people feel safe, psychologically feel safe coming into work, and they do not feel that they're being bullied into doing things, that is the job of everybody, especially the leaders, because they set that example in the workplace. So in this specific article about the Ellen DeGeneres show, it's the reason why I wanted to really revolve it around her show is because someone who is known as the so-called quote-unquote be kind lady, where the show has been running successfully for over 16, 17 years, and people absolutely love her. The personality, at least the public persona that we see on TV, is a very lovable figure. And what goes on in the background, the invisible part of workplace, is what was really laid bare in this article. And I'm going to put the link of it in the podcast description, so make sure to check it out. But this is a prime example that even someone as famous, as rich, as popular, as loved as Ellen DeGeneres is also not safe from a toxic workplace. And when you look into the details of this article, it comes down to the leadership. A lot of those accounts from different employees, current and former ones mainly, the fingers were just pointing straight at the leadership, which is why 3 of the top executives have resigned. I'm speaking now as someone who has previously worked in human resources for a long time, long enough in a toxic workplace to speak from a position where I can tell you that it's not enough to fire people who engage in bad behaviors, because it's one thing to fire them. It's another thing to then follow up and really keep a tab on how things are happening or how things are going in the workplace afterwards. And it's always an opportunity for leadership to self-reflect and review to see what exactly went wrong. Why did the behaviors of their leaders fail, and how can they make sure that this kind of behavior is not repeated again? If you're a business leader listening to this podcast, or if you're an HR manager listening to this podcast, or anybody in the field of HR, you need to look at the company policy or guidelines or employee handbook and see if you have anything spelled out, written out, that really outlines the behaviors that are acceptable and behaviors that are not acceptable. Things to do with bullying, things to do with sexual harassment, these policies need to be set in place. They need to be told, advertised, trainings need to happen. It's not enough for this to be a one-time training. It needs to be a consistent, ongoing training. There needs to be changes, updates to the training, examples being provided so that it just becomes completely internalized into the behavior, into the mindset of the management and team members and leaders of the organization. Because Ellen DeGeneres' show is not the only place where these kind of behaviors happen. It's not the only toxic workplace in the world, but it is the one toxic workplace which got exposed. And there are many other toxic workplaces which are miserable places to work in, and a lot of it has to do with the way leaders lead and the behaviors of the leaders, which then kind of gets replicated and trickled down to the entire organization. So if you happen to be somebody who has dealt with such cases where they've had to, if you're in human resources, for example, if you've had to deal with people who were fired for misconduct of any sort, where there was allegations of bullying in the workplace, please write to me and let me know how you dealt with it. You can reach me on info@podyourheartout.com. And for those of you who are business leaders, please understand that you could have the best of everything in terms of brand name. You could have a lot of power, influence, money, you name it. I mean, look at Ellen DeGeneres. Nothing gets better than that. And it only takes the bad behavior of a few people to ruin it all for the entire organization. Something like this might leak out, from about your organization. It could leak out to the media, and once it's out there, it is registered on the internet forever. And unless you're as big as Ellen and some of the other big companies like Amazon and Google, it's highly unlikely that you will be able to erase that from the internet. And once the word gets out in the market, it will stay there. So as a business leader, it's a cautionary tale. Make sure that your HR has the right policies in place. There are right processes for people to report cases of bullying, sexual harassment, that there's proper follow-up, and that there's proper accountability afterwards as well. And what will you do as a business leader when something like this is brought to your attention? Do you just turn around and say, oh, let HR handle it? Or do you actually sit down and pay attention and remember this podcast, that if you don't pay attention to it, it can really end up backfiring should the word get out. A lot of the times, even the most serious cases can be handled very well internally if only someone listens to the employees and pays some attention, and actually some action is carried on. There is some action done. Something is done after somebody complains about a manager's behavior, an executive's behavior, or anything that they have witnessed themselves. And my advice to people who may have experienced any kind of sexual harassment or bullying in workplace, please make sure that if you are to raise a case against somebody in the office, one of the first things you should probably do is to make sure that you have everything documented, because without a lot of solid proof, cases like this become very difficult, because then it just becomes, one person's word against another person's word, and trying to prove your side of the story in a case where not enough documentation has been recorded, it really makes it very complicated. So if you've experienced anything that has to do with bullying, misconduct with the leadership or executives, where you've gone to human resource department and nothing has happened about your claim, I would love to hear from you. Please write to me on info@podyourheartout.com. You can also visit www.podyourheartout.com or reach out to me on any of the social media channels of Pod Your Heart Out podcast. Thank you for listening, and until next time, I look forward to hearing from you.